That room has been empty for years, my husband said. And for a moment, I thought he was joking. Because just last night I stood right there beside the crib, my hand resting on the soft blue blanket, listening to the quiet rhythm of a baby breathing in the dark. But the look on his face wasn't playful, it was flat, almost rehearsed, like he'd said those words before. And I felt something inside my chest tighten as I stepped past him and pushed the door open wider, expecting to see the familiar shape of the crib by the window, the rocking chair in the corner, the little stuffed bear on the shelf. But there was nothing, not even dust where furniture should have been, just bare carpet and pale walls that looked like they hadn't held a memory in years. And I stood there frozen, my fingers still curled, as if I were holding something that no longer existed. And I remember blinking slowly, once, twice, trying to force the room to come back, trying to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind, because I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. I knew the weight of that child in my arms, the warmth, the quiet little sounds, the way the house had changed since he arrived. But behind me, my husband sighed softly, like I was the one being difficult, like I was the one creating a problem where none existed. And when I turned to look at him again, he was already walking away down the hallway, his footsteps slow and steady, as if this conversation was already over, as if there was nothing left to explain. And that was when Emily appeared at the end of the hall, my daughter-in-law, dressed perfectly as always, her expression calm, too calm, and she didn't even glance into the room, didn't ask what I was doing, didn't question why I was standing there shaking. She just gave me a small, polite smile, the kind you give a stranger at the grocery store, and said, "Breakfast is ready." Like everything in the world was exactly as it should be, and I felt the ground shift under me in a way I can't quite explain, because it wasn't just confusion, it was something deeper, something colder, like I had stepped into a version of my life that didn't belong to me. And as I slowly walked into that empty room, each step heavier than the last, I realized something that made my stomach drop, something I couldn't ignore no matter how much I wanted to, because the room might have been empty, but my memory wasn't. And if they were both acting like none of it had ever existed, then the question wasn't whether I was forgetting something, it was why they were pretending. I did not go to breakfast right away, even though I could hear the clink of dishes and the low murmur of voices from the kitchen, because something about that empty room held me in place, like if I stepped away too soon it would all disappear completely, and I needed to be certain. So I moved slowly across the carpet, counting each step in my head, as if grounding myself in something real. And I reached the wall where the crib had stood and ran my hand along it, expecting to feel the faint outline, the marks left behind from years of use. But the paint was smooth, untouched, like nothing had ever been there at all. And that was when the first real doubt crept in, not loud, not overwhelming, just a quiet whisper that maybe I had imagined more than I realized. Maybe grief had done something to me I had not yet understood, because I was not a young woman anymore and memory could play strange tricks. But then I closed my eyes and I saw it again, clear as daylight, the pale blue blanket, the mobile turning slowly above the crib, the soft hum of the baby monitor on the nightstand, and my hand tightened against the wall, because those were not vague impressions, they were details, and details do not come from nothing. So I opened my eyes again and stepped back, forcing myself to look at the room the way someone else might, detached, careful, searching for anything that did not belong. But everything was too perfect, too clean, like it had been prepared, and that thought made my chest tighten again in a different way, because clean was not the same as empty. Clean meant someone had taken the time to make it look this way. And suddenly the silence of the house felt heavier, like it was pressing in from all sides. So I turned and walked out into the hallway, my steps slower now, more deliberate. And when I reached the kitchen doorway, I paused, watching them before they noticed me. My husband sitting at the table with his coffee, reading the newspaper like he always did. Emily standing at the counter pouring orange juice into a glass, her movements precise and unhurried. And for a moment it looked so ordinary that I almost questioned everything again. But then I noticed the way they did not speak to each other, the way the air between them felt rehearsed, like actors waiting for a cue. And when Emily finally looked up and saw me, her smile appeared too quickly, too perfectly placed, and she said, "Good morning," in that same polite tone, as if we had never shared anything more than casual conversation. And I walked in slowly, taking my seat across from my husband, studying his face, searching for something familiar, something that would anchor me back to the life I knew. But he did not look up. Right away, he just turned the page of his newspaper and said, without any emotion at all, "You should get some rest. You have been confused lately." And the words settled over me in a way that felt heavier than any accusation, because they were not loud or angry. They were quiet, final, like a conclusion already agreed upon. And I felt my hands grow still in my lap as I realized that whatever was happening in this house, it was not an accident, it was not a misunderstanding, it was something they had already decided, something they were waiting for me to accept. And in that moment I understood that if I reacted, if I argued, if I tried to force the truth out into the open, I would only confirm whatever story they were telling about me. So instead I lowered my eyes, nodded slightly, and said nothing at all, because the only thing more dangerous than being confused was letting them know that I was not. I spent the rest of the morning moving through the house as if nothing had changed, but every step felt different, every sound slightly off, like I was walking through a place that only looked like my home on the surface, and I made a point not to ask any more questions, not to challenge anything they said, because I could feel it now, the way they were watching me without appearing to, the way every pause in my speech seemed to register. So I kept my voice steady when I thanked Emily for the coffee. I kept my expression calm when my husband mentioned the weather, and I let the conversation drift around me without truly joining it, because the moment I pushed back, I would become exactly what they were quietly suggesting I was, and I refused to give them that. Not yet. So instead I listened, and what I noticed was not what they said, but what they did not say. There was no mention of a baby, no passing comment, no absent-minded reference, nothing at all, as if that part of life had never existed, and the absence itself felt deliberate, like a blank space drawn carefully over something that used to be there. And after breakfast I excused myself, saying I needed to rest, using my husband's own words as a shield, and I walked slowly back down the hallway, not toward the empty room this time, but toward the small study at the end, the one no one paid much attention to anymore, because I needed to find something that belonged to me, something that had not been touched. And as I stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind me, I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. The air in here felt different, still, undisturbed, and I moved to the desk, opening drawers one by one, not searching wildly, but carefully, methodically, because if something had been erased, there would be traces. There were always traces, and my fingers brushed over old documents, receipts, photographs, and then I found it. A small stack tucked beneath a folder, photographs I had taken just weeks ago. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted them. And there it was, clear as anything. The nursery exactly as I remembered it. The crib by the window, the soft blue blanket folded neatly, the mobile casting faint shadows on the wall, and in one of the pictures, I was standing there, my hand resting on the railing, looking down with a quiet kind of peace that I could feel even now, and I stared at that image for a long moment, letting it anchor me, letting it prove what I already knew, that I was not imagining this, that something real had been taken, not forgotten, not misplaced, taken. And as that realization settled in, the fear that had been creeping along the edges of my thoughts shifted into something colder, sharper, because if the room could be changed, if the memory could be denied, then whoever was behind it believed they could control the entire story. And I carefully placed the photographs back where I found them, exactly as they were, because showing them now would only reveal what I knew, and I needed them to believe I was still uncertain, still fragile. So I straightened the papers, closed the drawer, and paused at the door, listening to the faint sounds of the house beyond, the quiet conversation, the measured footsteps, and I understood something then that made everything clearer. This was not about confusion. This was not about memory. This was about control. And the only way to take it back was to let them think they already had it. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I paid attention to time, not in the usual way of watching the clock, but in the way the house moved from one hour to the next, because routine can reveal more than words ever will. And I noticed how everything seemed carefully measured. My husband took his walk at exactly 2 o'clock, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. Emily made a phone call in the kitchen at 2:15, always with her back turned, her voice low, too low to make out the words. And by 2:30 the house would fall into a quiet that felt staged, like an empty set waiting for the next scene, and I sat in the living room with a book open on my lap, turning pages without reading them, letting my eyes drift instead to the hallway, to the door that led to the room they insisted had been empty for years, and I forced myself not to go there, not yet, because the moment I showed interest, the moment I revealed that I was still holding on to something they had erased, they would adjust, they would change the pattern, and right now the pattern was the only thing I had. So I waited, breathing slowly, keeping my movements small and predictable until I heard the front door close and my husband's footsteps fade down the driveway. And a few minutes later, Emily's voice rose slightly, still on the phone, but distracted, and then I heard the soft click of a door upstairs, followed by silence. Real silence this time, not the kind they performed, and I stood up carefully, placing the book exactly where it had been, and walked down the hallway with steady steps, my heart beating just a little faster, not from fear, but from certainty, because I knew. Now that whatever they had done, they believed it was complete, they believed there was nothing left to find, and that was their mistake, because people who erase things often forget that they cannot erase everything. And as I reached the door, I paused, listening, making sure the house held still around me, and then I turned the handle and stepped inside, and again the room greeted me with that same empty calm. But this time I did not look for what was missing, I looked for what did not belong. And it took a moment, just a small shift of focus, before I saw it. Near the baseboard by the window, a faint line in the carpet, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for, the kind of mark left by furniture that had been there long enough to press itself into place, and I crouched slowly, running my fingers along it, feeling the slight indentation, and a quiet understanding settled over me. Because that mark had not had time to disappear, no matter how clean the room looked. Time does not move that quickly, and that meant the crib had been here recently, very recently, and I let my hand rest there for a moment longer before I stood up again, my expression calm, my thoughts clear, because this was no longer about doubt, it was about proof, and proof meant they were not simply ignoring the truth, they were actively rewriting it. And as I stepped back into the hallway, closing the door softly behind me, I realized something else, something even more important. If they were willing to go this far to make me question reality, then whatever they were hiding was not small, it was something worth risking everything for. And that meant I needed to be careful, quieter than them, more patient than them, because the truth was still here, buried just beneath the surface, and I intended to find it before they realized I already had. That evening, I returned to the kitchen before either of them could call me, moving with the same quiet rhythm I had used all day, because routine was no longer just habit, it was camouflage. And when my husband walked in a few minutes later, he glanced at me briefly before taking his usual seat, unfolding his newspaper with that same steady motion. While Emily moved around the counter preparing dinner, her expression composed, her gestures precise, and I watched them the way one watches something fragile, careful not to disturb it, because now that I knew something had been removed, I could see the shape of the absence more clearly, and it was not just the room, it was in the way they spoke, the way they avoided certain topics without hesitation, the way entire pieces of life had been cut cleanly out of conversation. And when Emily set a plate in front of me, she paused just long enough to study my face, as if checking for something, and I met her gaze calmly, offering a small, polite smile in return, the kind that revealed nothing, and she nodded once before turning away, satisfied, or at least willing to pretend she was, and I lowered my eyes to my plate, letting the silence settle again, because silence, I realized, was where the truth lived now, not in what they said, but in what they carefully did not say. And after a few moments my husband cleared his throat and spoke about something ordinary, the weather, a neighbor, something distant and safe, and I responded, when necessary, keeping my voice even, my words measured, because every response was being weighed, and I could feel it, the quiet evaluation, the subtle test, and I passed it by giving them exactly what they expected, nothing more, nothing less. And as the conversation drifted, I noticed something small, something almost insignificant, but details like that had already proven their value. Emily mentioned a delivery scheduled for later in the week, something about rearranging space upstairs. And though she said it casually, the timing caught my attention, because you do not rearrange space that has been empty for years unless something is about to change. And I let that thought settle quietly, storing it away without reacting. And when dinner ended, I offered to help clean, knowing she would refuse, and she did, gently but firmly, just as she always did, maintaining that careful distance, and I stepped back, nodding, retreating to the living room where I could hear them again. Their voices lower now, not quite whispers, but close. Enough that the words blurred together, and I sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening not for meaning, but for tone, for hesitation, for anything that might slip through the cracks. And though I could not make out what they were saying, I recognized something in the rhythm, a tension just beneath the surface, like they were discussing something that required agreement, coordination, and that confirmed what I already suspected. This was not a single decision, not a moment of confusion. This was planned, sustained. And as the evening settled into night, I rose quietly and made my way back to the study, closing the door softly behind me. And this time I did not search randomly. I went straight to the photographs again, holding them carefully under the light, studying every detail, every shadow, every angle. And then I noticed something I had missed before. In the corner of one image, barely visible, was a reflection in the window, faint but clear enough if you looked closely. A figure standing just outside the frame. Not me, not the baby, someone else. And my breath slowed as I leaned closer, recognizing the outline, the posture, the way the light caught the edge of her hair. It was Emily, watching, not participating, just standing there. And in that moment, everything shifted slightly, because whatever had been taken from that room, she had been there from the beginning. And that meant this was not something I had simply stumbled into. It was something I had been allowed to see. And that realization settled deep, quiet, and steady, because if they believed I was still searching for answers, they had no idea I had just found the first real one. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind had finally stopped questioning and started observing. And once that shift happens, there is no going back. Every sound becomes information, every silence becomes a message. And sometime after midnight I heard it, a soft movement above me, not loud enough to wake someone who was not listening, but I was. And I lay still, counting the seconds between each faint creak, each careful step. And it was not my husband. His gait was heavier, more predictable. This was lighter, deliberate, and I knew immediately who it was. Emily, moving through the upper floor at an hour when the house was supposed to be still, and I did not get up right away. I waited, letting her move freely, letting her believe no one was paying attention, because people reveal more when they think they are alone. And after several minutes the movement stopped, followed by a soft click, a door closing gently, and then nothing. And I turned my head slowly toward the hallway, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. And I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again, the kind that does not rush, does not panic, it simply waits. So I rose from the bed without turning on the light, my steps slow and controlled, and made my way toward the stairs, placing each foot carefully to avoid any sound. And when I reached the top, I paused, listening, the house holding its breath around me, and then I moved forward, not toward the bedroom, but toward that room, the one that was supposed to be empty. And as I approached, I noticed something I had not seen before, a faint line of light at the bottom of the door, thin but unmistakable, and my hand hovered near the handle for just a moment, not from hesitation, but from precision, because once I opened it, there would be no pretending I did not know. And I needed to be sure of what I was stepping into. So I leaned closer, listening. And there it was, barely audible, a sound so soft it could have been dismissed if I had not been waiting for it. A quiet, rhythmic noise, not mechanical, not the hum of a machine, but something organic, something alive. And my fingers tightened slightly as I slowly turned the handle, easing. The door opened just enough to see inside. And what I saw was not emptiness, not at all. The room was dimly lit, the outline of furniture returned, the crib back in its place by the window, the soft blue blanket exactly as I remembered it, and standing beside it, her back to me, was Emily, her posture still, her head slightly tilted as if she were listening to something only she could hear. And for a moment I did not move. I simply stood there, watching, because this was the truth, not the version they showed me in daylight, but the one they thought no one else would ever see. And as the seconds passed, Emily shifted slightly, her hand resting on the edge of the crib, a gesture so natural, so practiced, that it confirmed everything I already knew. This had never been empty, not for a single moment. And as I stepped back quietly, closing the door without a sound, I felt something settle deep inside me. Not fear, not confusion, but clarity, because now I understood the game they were playing, and more importantly, I understood that they believed I was not part of it, and that was the only advantage I needed. The next morning, I moved through the house exactly as I had the day before, calm, measured, predictable, because now that I had seen the truth with my own eyes, the most important thing was to protect that knowledge, to keep it hidden from them the same way they had hidden everything from me. And when Emily greeted me in the kitchen with that same polite smile, I returned it without hesitation, as if nothing had changed, as if I had slept soundly through the night, and she studied me for a fraction of a second longer than usual before turning back to the counter, satisfied again. And I realized then how carefully she was watching, not constantly, but in small, precise moments, like she was waiting for something to slip, and I gave her nothing, not a single crack to follow. And as the morning unfolded, I paid attention to everything, not just what they did, but when they did it, the timing, the rhythm, the small adjustments that revealed more than any conversation ever could. And by mid-morning, I noticed something new, something that had not been there the day before, a small device on the shelf near the hallway, subtle, almost decorative, but placed too deliberately to be meaningless, and I passed by it slowly, not stopping, not even turning my head, but I registered it. The angle, the placement, the faint reflection of light on its surface, and I understood immediately. They were not just controlling the story, they were monitoring it, making sure it remained intact. And that knowledge settled into me quietly, not as fear, but as confirmation. Because if they were watching this closely, then whatever they were hiding was even more important than I had imagined. And later, when my husband left the house again and Emily retreated upstairs, I did not follow her, not this time. Instead, I moved into the study and closed the door, taking out the photographs once more, but now I looked at them differently, not as memories, but as evidence, and I studied the details again. The reflection in the window, Emily's presence in the background, the positioning of the crib, the angle of the light. And then I noticed something else, something I had overlooked before, a small object on the dresser, barely visible in the corner of the frame. And I leaned closer, narrowing my focus, recognizing the shape slowly. A monitor, the kind used to listen from another room, and my thoughts aligned quickly, because that meant what I heard last night was not an accident, not a coincidence. It was part of a system, something maintained, something controlled. And as I set the photograph down carefully, I let that realization settle fully, because this was no longer about proving I was right. It was about understanding why they needed me to be wrong. And that answer was not going to be found in the obvious places, not in the room, not in the photographs, but in the spaces in between, in the patterns they assumed I could not see. And when I stepped back into the hallway, I did so with the same quiet composure, my expression unchanged, my movement steady, because now I was not just observing, I was waiting, and the difference between those two things was everything. Because observing gathers information, but waiting chooses the moment to use it. And as Emily's footsteps echoed softly from above, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible pause, just long enough to feel the weight of what I now knew, before continuing on, because they believed they were in control of this house, of this story, of me, and for now, I was going to let them believe it, because the only way to uncover the full truth was to let them keep building the lie. By the third day, I no longer needed to guess. I understood the structure of their routine well enough to move inside it without disturbing anything. And that was when I decided to test it, not openly, not in a way that would raise suspicion, but in the smallest possible way, the kind of shift that only someone watching closely would notice. And that morning, instead of sitting in the living room after breakfast, I lingered in the hallway just a second longer than usual, my hand brushing lightly against the shelf where the small device sat. And I felt it then, a faint warmth beneath my fingertips, subtle but unmistakable. And I moved on immediately, not pausing, not reacting. But that single detail told me everything I needed to know. It was active, always active. And as I continued down the hall, I allowed my pace to slow just slightly, enough to change the timing of my steps without making it obvious. And I listened, not for voices, but for shifts, for the quiet adjustments that would follow, and they did, Just as I expected, a few minutes later I heard movement upstairs, quicker than before, less controlled, like someone responding to something unexpected, and I lowered my gaze, hiding the faint understanding that settled in my expression, because now I knew the device was not just decoration, it was part of their system, part of how they maintained the version of reality they had constructed. And that meant they were not only erasing, they were monitoring the absence, making sure it stayed intact. And later that afternoon, when Emily passed by me in the kitchen, she paused again, just long enough to study my face. And this time there was something else in her eyes, not concern, not confusion, but calculation, as if she were trying to decide whether something had shifted. And I met her gaze calmly, offering the same steady expression I had practiced, the same quiet composure. And after a moment, she nodded and continued on, satisfied once more. But the difference was clear. She was no longer certain, and that was enough, because uncertainty creates mistakes, and mistakes reveal truth. And that evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, I made a small change, one that would seem meaningless to anyone not paying attention. I left the study door slightly ajar, not wide enough to draw notice, just enough to alter the line of sight. And I placed the photograph on the desk in a position where it could be seen from the hallway, not obviously, but enough that if someone were looking, truly looking, they would notice it. And then I returned to the living room, sitting with my hands folded in my lap, my posture relaxed, my breathing steady, waiting, not watching, just waiting, because now the balance had shifted. They believed they were observing me, controlling the narrative. But in reality, I had introduced something new into their system, something they did not expect. And as the minutes passed, I listened to the house again, the faint movements, the subtle pauses, and eventually, I heard it, the soft, careful step outside the study door, slower than usual, more deliberate, followed by a moment of stillness. And I did not turn my head, I did not react, but I felt it, the shift, the hesitation, because for the first time, they were not just maintaining the lie, they were checking it. And that meant one thing. They were no longer certain that it was holding. The moment I heard that hesitation outside the study, I knew something had shifted, not dramatically, not enough to break their control, but enough to introduce doubt. And doubt, once it takes hold, does not stay contained. It spreads quietly, reshaping decisions, slowing movements, creating cracks where there were none before. And I kept my gaze forward, my posture relaxed, giving no indication that I had noticed anything at all, because the strength of what I had set in motion depended entirely on their belief that I remained unaware. And after a few seconds, the faint sound of footsteps moved away from the door, slower than before, more cautious, and I allowed a small breath to leave me, steady and controlled, because that was the first reaction I had drawn from them, the first sign that the story they had constructed was no longer as stable as they believed. And later that night, when the house settled into its usual rhythm, I followed the pattern I had already learned, waiting, listening, observing. And just as before, the quiet movement came from upstairs. But this time it was different, not as smooth, not as certain. There was a pause midway, a slight break in the rhythm. And that told me everything I needed to know. They were thinking now, adjusting, questioning. And that was exactly where I needed them. Because people who are certain make no mistakes, but people who question themselves begin to reveal things they cannot control. And when I moved toward the stairs, I did so with the same careful precision, placing each step lightly, allowing the house to remain still around me. And as I reached the top, I saw it again, that faint line of light beneath the door. But this time, I did not approach immediately. I waited, just out of sight, listening. And the sound inside was clearer now, not just the soft rhythm I had heard before, but a faint whisper, a voice, Emily's voice, low and controlled, speaking in tones too quiet to fully understand, but distinct enough to confirm that she was not alone in her thoughts, that she was interacting with something, maintaining something. And I felt a calm settle deeper within me, because this was no longer a question of whether the truth existed. It was a matter of how far they had gone to hide it, and how much they were willing to risk to keep it hidden. And after a moment, I stepped back silently, choosing not to open the door this time, because I did not need to see it again. I needed them to continue believing that I would not. And as I returned to my room, closing the door gently behind me, I allowed myself a moment to sit in the quiet, letting everything align, the photographs, The hidden room, the device in the hallway, the late-night movements, all of it forming a pattern too. Precise to be accidental, and I understood then that whatever they were protecting was not just a secret. It was something they believed belonged to them alone, something they had already removed me from completely, and that realization did not bring anger. It brought clarity, because now I knew exactly what I needed to do. I did not need to confront them. I did not need to argue or demand answers. I needed to let them continue, to let the pattern grow more complex, more fragile, until it reached the point where it could no longer hold itself together. And when that moment came, when the truth surfaced on its own, without force, without warning, I would be ready, not as someone searching for answers, but as someone who already understood the entire game. And as I lay back in the darkness, my eyes open, my breathing slow and even, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else. They believed they had erased my place in this house, in this story, but they had made one mistake. They had left me here long enough to see how it was done, and now that I knew, I was no longer the one being watched. I was the one waiting for them to reveal everything.